Story 1. Last autumn, I spent a fortnight residing at the dwelling of my maternal grandparents, situated in the rural expanse of Maine. My mother had successfully persuaded me to embark on this journey, especially after a particularly tumultuous period back in my hometown, suggesting that the serene tranquility of the countryside would greatly benefit my state of mind. Their residence was perched precariously at the very edge of a dense, formidable forest, the kind of arboreal expanse that appeared to absorb and mute every single sound once dusk descended. I hadn't visited this particular location since my early childhood, yet a palpable sense of chill pervaded the atmosphere, making it feel notably colder than my recollections. As always, my grandparents extended their warmth and hospitality, though my grandfather, in particular, had become remarkably taciturn over the years. His customary posture involved sitting quietly near the expansive window, which offered an unobstructed view of the surrounding trees, a cup of freshly brewed coffee invariably clutched in his hand, simply observing. My grandmother informed me that he had maintained this withdrawn demeanor for several years, ever since the fateful night their beloved canine companion ventured into the depths of the woods and regrettably never returned. At that precise moment, I didn't attach much significance to this detail. During that initial night, I found myself grappling with considerable difficulty in attempting to fall asleep. The prevailing silence was oppressively profound, unsettlingly unnatural in its stillness. It was far from the peaceful, soothing quiet one might anticipate in a serene rural setting. Instead, it felt as though the entire surrounding area was held in a collective, suspenseful breath. Around the hour of 2 a.m., I eventually managed to drift into a restless slumber, yet I was plagued by the peculiar sensation that I was not entirely alone within the confines of the room. The subsequent day unfolded without any notable incidents. I assisted with various household chores, meticulously stacking piles of firewood, and took the opportunity to explore the familiar backyard trail that I distinctly remembered from my early childhood adventures. However, when I casually mentioned the possibility of venturing into the woods a little further, perhaps for a deeper hike, my grandmother immediately and decisively shook her head. "We no longer venture past the tree line," she stated, her tone almost unnervingly casual. That same evening, my grandfather uttered words for the very first time since my arrival. He did not direct his gaze towards me. Instead, he kept his eyes resolutely fixed on the window as he spoke. "Ensure the blinds are drawn before you retire for the night," he instructed. "And under no circumstances should you look outside. Not at that specific time." I inquired about the deeper meaning behind his words, but he merely reverted to his silent state, rocking gently and rhythmically in his chair. That particular night, I remained awake, lying tensely on the sofa in the guest room, which directly faced the backyard. At approximately 2:13 a.m., I distinctly heard what sounded like the deliberate crunching of dry leaves, accompanied by slow, exceedingly methodical footsteps. My body instantly froze in a primal state of fear. Yet, an overwhelming surge of curiosity ultimately triumphed over my trepidation, and I cautiously peeked through a small corner of the curtain, and it was then that I saw him. He was merely standing there, precisely at the tree line, imposing in his height, completely motionless, and directly facing the house. I found myself unable to discern any specific facial features or distinguishing characteristics. There were no telltale glowing eyes or grotesquely twisted limbs or any other elements that would suggest a fabricated or illusory presence, it was simply a man, as immobile as solid stone, and he did not shift even an inch from his spot. I observed him intently for nearly a full minute. He never took a single step closer, nor did he ever retreat. For a brief moment, I even entertained the thought that it might be some peculiar wooden figure or an optical illusion caused by the play of light. But then, without any prior warning whatsoever, he turned. Not in a dramatic or abrupt fashion, but rather he smoothly pivoted, precisely as a person would, and then calmly walked back into the depths of the woods. I did not manage to sleep at all after that disquieting encounter. I kept my gaze fixed on the exact spot where he had stood, half expecting him to reappear. However, the woods remained perfectly still. It was almost more disconcerting that he had departed, as if the pivotal moment had passed, yet the underlying presence or threat had not truly ended. I felt in profound sense that I had witnessed something I was explicitly forbidden to see. The following morning, I chose not to make any mention of what I had experienced. My grandparents behaved with their usual normalcy, serving me warm pancakes and engaging in casual conversation about the day's weather, as if absolutely nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. Nevertheless, I became aware that my grandfather was observing me with increased scrutiny, almost as if he already possessed knowledge of my nocturnal encounter. His constant gaze seemed to repeatedly drift towards the dense woods that stretched out just beyond the window pane. That entire day felt inexplicably heavier, somehow, as if the oppressive silence emanating from the trees had imperceptibly crept closer to the very confines of the house itself. Even the customarily lively birds were unnervingly quiet. I ventured out into the backyard during the daylight hours, attempting to convince myself that what I had seen was nothing more than a figment of my imagination. However, the exact location where the man had been standing sent profound chills down my spine. There were no discernible footprints whatsoever. The fallen leaves remained utterly undisturbed, and the grass beneath appeared completely untouched. I desperately wanted to believe that I had merely imagined the entire experience, that it had simply been a vivid dream. But I had not been asleep. I vividly recalled how sharply the cold sensation had pressed against the window glass. That night, I found myself utterly unable to bring myself to close the blinds, directly contradicting my grandfather's explicit instruction. I felt an undeniable need to ascertain if he would indeed return. I sat in the profound darkness, vigilantly watching through a narrow, precarious gap in the curtains. Nothing remarkable occurred for several hours. But precisely at 2:13 a.m., I heard it once more. Those very same slow, deliberate footsteps rustling on the dry leaves. He materialized from the enveloping shadows, stepping out from the identical spot as he had before. There was no flashlight, no discernible movement other than the simple acts of walking and then stopping. He maintained the same imposing height, the same unsettling stillness. But this time, his head slowly, eerily tilted to one side, as if he possessed an innate awareness that I was intently observing him. My heart began to pound violently in my throat, a frantic drumbeat of terror. I recoiled swiftly from the window and sank down onto the floor, desperately attempting not to produce a single sound. I did not dare to look again, not until the first faint light of dawn appeared. When I finally risked a peek, he was undeniably gone. Yet, the churning sensation in my stomach had not departed with him. The following morning, I discovered my grandfather outside, engaged in the laborious task of chopping wood. He did not cease his work when I approached, merely muttering, "You looked out, didn't you?" I responded with a simple nod of affirmation. His facial expression tightened discernibly. "Do not do it again. He only becomes aware of your presence if you notice him." I inquired about the identity of the man. My grandfather shook his head slowly. "No one truly knows. He does not inherently belong to this specific place." He added, "Not in the conventional sense. Some nights, he ventures closer. This only occurs when someone actively acknowledges him. You provide him with a reason. He remembers you." The terrifying notion that I had somehow extended an invitation to this entity merely by looking at him made my skin crawl with revulsion. I began to keep my mobile phone positioned beside my bed, fully prepared to contact someone if the events were to recur. I even contemplated departing earlier than planned, yet an inexplicable intuition suggested that such an action would no longer make any substantive difference. That particular night, I made an earnest effort to fall asleep early, ensuring that the blinds were completely shut, precisely as my grandfather had explicitly warned. I even exerted myself to push a heavy dresser in front of the window, purely for the sake of achieving some semblance of peace of mind. I harbored uncertainty as to whether it would genuinely matter, but it afforded me a marginal feeling of security, at least until I discerned the faint tapping. It was initially subtle, barely perceptible above the gentle hum of the space heater. Then it progressively intensified, becoming sharper, more resolute, akin to fingernails lightly scraping against the glass surface. I was certain I had securely closed the blinds. I was aware that the window was thoroughly obstructed, yet I also knew with an unnerving certainty that the distinct sound I was hearing was not a product of my imagination. I remained utterly frozen in my bed, my gaze fixed on the ceiling, not daring to make the slightest movement. The tapping abruptly ceased, only to be supplanted by a faint, quiet creaking sound. Floorboards. It sounded precisely like something shifting its weight on the porch outside. I found myself utterly unable to rationalize or explain it, but I distinctly felt that same profound, chilling presence once again. When the morning finally arrived, I did not experience a sense of relief. Instead, I felt as though I had been indelibly marked somehow, as if the surrounding forest had now become acutely aware of my individual existence. My grandfather did not pose any questions. He simply handed me a steaming mug of coffee and settled himself across the table from me, a visibly tired expression etched into his eyes. "I should have told you sooner," he remarked. "It began with me, too. I looked out once, many years ago." He cast a swift glance towards the woods. "He is exceptionally patient. Some individuals encounter him only once, while others are tormented by his presence for the remainder of their natural lives. I harbored an intense desire to inquire about his intentions, to understand why he consistently stood there at the identical time every single night. However, something about the very act of posing that question aloud felt profoundly incorrect, as if merely wondering about him would inexplicably confer upon him more significance, more defined form, and a greater impetus to draw ever closer. That evening, I methodically packed my personal belongings. I informed my grandparents that I was compelled to depart a few days ahead of schedule, fabricating some plausible excuse related to my work obligations. They offered no argument. My grandmother embraced me warmly, but she appeared noticeably distracted. My grandfather merely nodded solemnly. "If you should hear him again," he cautioned, "do not, under any circumstances, respond." I drove away just after the sun had set, continuously observing the trees in my rearview mirror as they progressively diminished into the distant landscape. For the first time in several days, I felt as though I could finally breathe with ease again. I adamantly told myself that the ordeal was definitively over, that I had successfully left whatever that ominous thing was far behind me. However, it has now been many weeks. I am back in the vibrant bustle of the city. It is a different environment, filled with louder noises and a multitude of distractions. Yet, despite all this, every single night I awaken at approximately 2:13 a.m. And on one occasion, I distinctly thought I heard the faint tapping once more. I have not dared to look yet. But a persistent part of me is convinced that he has somehow discovered my new location. Story 2. Last summer, my companion Tyler successfully persuaded me to embark on a weekend camping excursion near the rural residence of his cousin in the vast wilderness of Montana. It was a remarkably quiet and isolated patch of woodland situated just beyond the perimeter of a quaint, diminutive town known as Calverton, which was scarcely more than a lone post office and a pair of modest gas stations. I wasn't particularly inclined towards camping, but I reasoned that a brief period away from my usual routine would undoubtedly prove beneficial. I certainly did not anticipate returning with a narrative that continues to defy my complete comprehension. We arrived at our destination during the late afternoon hours, proceeding to set up our individual tents near a narrow clearing position just off a meandering gravel trail. Tyler's cousin, Drew, had previously visited this location and assured us that it was a tranquil area where human presence was exceedingly rare. He had been raised in Calverton and remarked that the local woods always possessed a peculiar, slightly unsettling quality, but he chose not to elaborate further on this observation. At the time, we simply dismissed it as typical small-town folklore or local eccentricity. The initial evening proceeded in a completely normal fashion. We shared inexpensive beer, exchanged jovial jokes, and struggled with firewood that stubbornly refused to ignite properly. We congregated around the flickering campfire, trading old, familiar stories, the kind that invariably feel more terrifying when recounted in the enveloping darkness. Around the stroke of midnight, the ambience began to shift towards an unnerving quietness. Not in a peaceful or soothing manner, but in a way that caused all three of us to gradually cease our conversations without even consciously realizing it. We failed to hear a single hoot from an owl, detected no gentle rustle of wind, nothing at all. It was as if the entire locale had abruptly been plunged into a state of absolute muteness. Tyler, with a nervous laugh, quipped, "Perhaps the woods are giving us the cold shoulder, trying to deliberately spook us." Drew, however, did not share his amusement. He simply cast a solemn gaze towards the tree line and gravely stated, "They are listening now." I initially presumed he was attempting to play a prank on us, but there was an unmistakable quality in his voice that felt profoundly disconcerting. I asked him to clarify his meaning, but he merely shook his head and retreated into his tent earlier than usual. This left me and Tyler sitting there in an increasingly heavy silence, attentively listening for something we didn't quite comprehend was impending. Eventually, We extinguished the campfire and made our way into our respective tents. I am uncertain how long I had been asleep before I distinctly heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffling noise, akin to someone slowly treading over a carpet of pine needles just outside my tent. I initially thought it might be Drew stirring to relieve himself, but then I heard it again, this time originating from the opposite side of the tent, sounding precisely like someone walking in a slow, deliberate circle around our sleeping forms. I quietly sat upright, making a concerted effort not to produce any sound myself. The footsteps were steady, unhurried, and far too light to be those of an animal. Then I heard something else, my given name. Uttered barely above a whisper, as if someone was crouched directly outside the thin nylon wall. Ryan. It was spoken with chilling clarity, yet devoid of any sense of urgency. I held my breath, my heart pounding. A second later, I heard Tyler's name spoken in the identical low, unnerving tone. Tyler. It sounded as though it were testing the very pronunciation of the names. The voice itself was unfamiliar to me, yet it did not sound artificial or forced. It resonated as natural, calm, and somehow, that precise quality rendered the experience infinitely more horrifying. There were no footsteps now, only a profound silence once more. I waited, ardently hoping that whatever it was had moved on. But the prevailing quiet did not feel reassuringly safe. It felt oppressively heavy, the kind of silence that instills such dread that one is afraid to even blink. I had no way of knowing if Tyler or Drew had also perceived it. I was too utterly terrified to utter a single word. I barely managed to sleep for the remainder of that night. Each time I began to drift off, I swore I heard faint movements again. Sometimes a solitary step, sometimes a hushed whisper, but it never approached close enough to be undeniably clear, and never receded far enough for me to dismiss or forget. I remained securely zipped inside my tent, utterly frozen beneath the comforting weight of my sleeping bag. By the time morning arrived, the forest had reverted to its normal appearance. Birds were cheerfully chirping, as if absolutely nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. Tyler looked noticeably tired but offered no comment. When I cautiously inquired if he had heard anything peculiar, he merely gave a vague, non-committal shrug and stated that he had experienced difficulty sleeping. Drew maintained his silence, as if he harbored no desire whatsoever to discuss the matter. Later that day, we embarked on a brief hike, venturing a little deeper into the woods. We did not go a great distance, just far enough to discover a nearby creek and replenish our water bottles. Everything seemed tranquil, but I observed something peculiar in the soft dirt by the creek bank, distinct shoe prints arranged in a complete circle, not the impressions of boots, but rather of bare feet. I pointed them out to my companions, but Drew simply suggested that animals occasionally leave behind strange and misleading impressions. I genuinely wanted to believe that explanation. I truly did, but the shape of the prints was far too defined and clean, the arch and toes unmistakably human, and what type of animal would walk around barefoot in a perfect circular loop? That night, we built a significantly stronger fire and remained awake later than usual, desperately attempting to dispel the pervasive weirdness. Tyler initiated playing music quietly on his mobile phone, opting for anything that might make the oppressive silence feel less sharp and menacing. But around the stroke of midnight, the mobile signal abruptly dropped, and the music instantly cut off. The woods immediately reverted to a state of absolute, dead silence. Drew stood up and tossed additional wood onto the blazing fire. "It's starting again," he muttered, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, as if he were simply stating an undeniable fact. Tyler cast a questioning glance at him but refrained from asking any direct questions. None of us did. It felt as though the very trees themselves were patiently waiting for us to do so. That night, I kept my flashlight firmly gripped in one hand, my mobile phone in the other. I did not manage to fall asleep. I simply lay there, meticulously listening. And precisely on cue, at 2 a.m., the footsteps returned. This time, they were noticeably slower, more deliberately patient. I heard them complete 2 full circles before they finally halted at the very back of my tent. Then, the whisper returned, "Ryan." It was soft, almost paradoxically kind, like someone fondly calling out from a distant memory. A single second passed. "Tyler." Then another agonizing pause. Then a new name was uttered. "Drew." That marked the first occasion I heard it speak all 3 of our names. And that, unequivocally, was the most terrifying part of the entire experience. I snapped my fingers twice inside the tent. This was an old, prearranged signal that Tyler and I used when we wished to communicate without alerting someone else to our conversation. He did not respond. There was no reciprocal finger snap. I desperately wanted to call out, but an overwhelming instinct instructed me not to make a single sound. That ominous entity was still out there. I must have remained utterly frozen in that petrified position for nearly an entire hour. My flashlight was activated but pointed downwards, illuminating only the tent floor. The whispering had ceased, but I could still distinctly sense something nearby. I continuously anticipated a dark shadow falling across the tent wall. But nothing materialized. Only in profound stillness and the low, persistent hum of panic reverberating within my chest. Eventually, I heard footsteps once more, this time moving away, but they did not retreat in the manner of a person simply walking off. It sounded more akin to something fading, like a presence being gradually withdrawn, rather than a physical body departing. I finally allowed myself to breathe, but I did not unzip the tent. I harbored no desire whatsoever to glimpse what lurked outside. When the sun's rays finally illuminated the camp, I cautiously stepped outside. Drew and Tyler were already seated by the fire pit, neither of them speaking. Tyler appeared noticeably pale. Drew was intently staring into the cooling ashes, as if something significant had been left behind. No one verbally mentioned the footsteps, but we all possessed an unspoken understanding that they had indeed occurred. We dismantled our camp in record time. No one needed to articulate the necessity, we simply needed to leave that place immediately. While I was meticulously packing my belongings, I discovered something outside my tent flap. It was a stick, approximately 8 inches in length, with my given name lightly scratched into its bark. It had most certainly not been there the preceding day. I chose not to display it to the others. I simply and quietly tossed it deep into the surrounding woods and continued my packing. A part of me clung to the hope that it was merely a prank, even though I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was not. I could still vividly recall the precise manner in which my name had been whispered, too soft, too meticulously careful to ever be forgotten. The drive back to town was enveloped in silence. We dropped Drew off at his cousin's dwelling, and he did not even utter a farewell. Tyler remained silent until we were nearly an hour down the highway. "We are not to disclose this to anyone," he stated firmly. I simply nodded in agreement. And we never did. Since that particular weekend, I have experienced persistent difficulty sleeping. Every now and then, around the identical hour, I perceive faint movement outside my window. A subtle scrape, perhaps even a whisper. It is never loud. It is never undeniably clear. But it consistently sounds as though it is patiently awaiting a response. Sometimes I contemplate returning to that location, purely to convince myself that the entire experience was a mere figment of my imagination, but I know, deep down, that such an action would be a grave error. There was an entity within those woods that had become aware of our presence, and it does not forget the names it pronounces aloud. I have not communicated with Drew or Tyler in several months. We did not have a disagreement, we simply drifted apart. Perhaps each of us is attempting to process and move on from the experience in our own individual way. But a part of me remains acutely aware that we are still inextricably connected by that terrifying night, by whatever entity circled our tent and articulated our names as if it knew us intimately. Story 3. When I reached the age of 16, my parents made arrangements for me to reside with my uncle for a period of several weeks while they attended to some pressing personal matters back home. He was the proprietor of a sprawling stretch of farmland situated just beyond the limits of a minuscule Iowa town, a place that consisted of scarcely more than a solitary diner, a small church, and a handful of dilapidated, worn-down homes, the quintessential kind of locale where silence is not perceived as tranquil, but rather as a profound and unsettling emptiness. I didn't particularly mind the sense of isolation, but his property consistently exuded an unnerving aura. The barn, in particular, sat near the very edge of his expansive land, appearing disproportionately large, almost excessively so for the limited extent to which he actually utilized it. It featured weathered wooden siding, a roof of rusted tin, and emitted a pervasive, thick odor that stubbornly clung to one's clothing. My uncle consistently refrained from allowing me inside, asserting that it was too aged, too structurally unstable, and simply not worth the risk of curious exploration. However, I observed something distinctly peculiar about it on the very first day of my stay. There was a formidable, heavy padlock securing a trap door located at the rear of the barn floor. It was affixed with a thick, industrial-grade chain. When I cautiously inquired about it, my uncle became remarkably taciturn and simply stated, that particular section remains shut. It always has been. His tone was utterly flat, neither conveying anger nor fear, but simply an immutable finality. I chose not to press the matter further. Most days were largely uneventful. I assisted with various farm chores, meticulously repairing fencing, and occasionally drove into the nearby town with him to procure necessary supplies. At night, I would often sit on the porch, gazing at the myriad stars that dotted the vast, unpolluted sky. There were very few artificial lights in that remote area, just the ambient sounds of the wind and the persistent chirping of insects. But one particular night, I believed I perceived movement near the barn, a fleeting flicker. It lasted for only a fraction of a second, and I initially convinced myself that it was merely an animal, likely a raccoon or a deer, but I found myself continuously checking over my shoulder as I made my way back inside the house. The following morning, I discovered the main barn door cracked open by approximately 6 inches. My uncle was meticulous and never left anything unsecured, not even his pickup truck. I gently closed it and chose not to bring it to his attention. Later that same day, I happened to observe him standing in the doorway of the barn, staring intently into its shadowy interior, utterly motionless, and completely silent. When he became aware of my watchful gaze, he quickly turned and walked away without a word. He offered no explanation for his behavior, and I, in turn, did not ask. Something in his demeanor conveyed a clear message not to. That night, the wind intensified considerably. It rattled the windows violently, caused the roof to groan under the strain, and whistled eerily through the numerous gaps in the attic boards. Around 1 a.m., I heard something else entirely. A distinct metal clinking sound, clearly not attributable to the wind. It sounded precisely like chains being tested, pulled taut, and then abruptly released. I rose from my bed and walked to the front room, cautiously peeking through the window in the direction of the barn. The massive building stood eerily still in the profound darkness, yet there was an unsettling quietness about it, as if the force of the wind did not even touch it. I remained standing there for nearly 10 minutes, patiently waiting for something, anything, to stir. Eventually, I returned to bed, attempting to reassure myself that the sounds were simply the storm interacting with old, creaking hinges. But deep within my consciousness, I harbored an undeniable certainty that something fundamental had shifted. The barn had transitioned from merely being strange to feeling profoundly wrong. And I had not even set foot inside it yet. The next day, my uncle was even more subdued than usual. Over breakfast, he scarcely uttered a single word, merely sipping his coffee and staring blankly out the window towards the ominous barn. I tentatively asked if everything was all right. He paused for an extended second before muttering, "Some things are better left shut." I did not press him for further details, but throughout the entire morning, I found my gaze repeatedly drawn towards the barn, consumed by curiosity about what he might be concealing beneath that enigmatic trapdoor. I wasn't deliberately attempting to be disrespectful, I was simply consumed by an insatiable curiosity. And the more I pondered it, the more that imposing padlock began to feel like an irresistible invitation. That afternoon, while my uncle was napping peacefully in his recliner, I discreetly made my way to the barn. The massive door creaked loudly as I slowly opened it. Inside, the air was surprisingly colder than it ought to have been, akin to stepping into a damp cellar, even though the oppressive summer heat continued to cling to every surface outside. The interior of the place was cluttered with various pieces of unused equipment, weathered old wooden ladders, and a broken wagon wheel, but my eyes immediately fixated on the trap door located at the very back. The heavy chain was still in place, and the padlock appeared intact, yet it somehow looked newer than every other object in the barn, as if it had been very recently replaced. I knelt down beside it, tentatively placing my hand on the wooden surface. It felt noticeably colder than the surrounding air. The boards did not yield or creak as one might anticipate, instead, they felt oddly solid, almost as if they were not hollow underneath. Then I heard something faint, not a distinct movement, but rather a soft, rhythmic, breathing, slow and steady, precisely like someone deeply asleep on the other side. I recoiled backward swiftly, nearly tripping over a forgotten bag of feed. My heart was audibly pounding in my ears, but the barn remained eerily quiet. Nothing pursued me. Nothing called out. I stood there for another minute before resolutely shutting the door behind me and making my way back to the relative safety of the house. That evening, my uncle did not inquire about my whereabouts, but I strongly suspected he already knew. He meticulously avoided making eye contact, merely instructing me to securely lock the back door before retiring for the night and to ensure my window remained closed. His tone was again low and flat, but something about it felt noticeably tighter this time, more strained. I attempted to watch television to shake off the persistent feeling of unease, but nothing managed to capture my attention. Around the stroke of midnight, the power flickered twice and then completely extinguished. The house was plunged into profound silence, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock somewhere in the impenetrable darkness. I utilized the flashlight function on my mobile phone to inspect the windows, purely out of habit. That's when I observed the barn once more. One of its side doors was now wide open, not merely cracked, but fully ajar. I knew with absolute certainty that my uncle had not gone out there. I hadn't heard the screen door shut. I clutched my phone tightly and backed away from the window. I did not wish to awaken my uncle, but I also harbored no desire whatsoever to investigate the barn alone. I simply stood there, straining to hear footsteps or voices, anything at all. But all I could discern was the distant, unsettling creak of something heavy swinging. The wind was not blowing strongly enough to cause that massive door to move. It swayed once, then came to an abrupt halt. I kept my gaze fixed on the ominous opening, half expecting something dreadful to step into the faint light, but there was only an encompassing darkness, the kind that appeared to swallow the very ground around it. It was then that I noticed it. The padlock was unequivocally gone. I could just barely perceive the faint outline of the cellar door, but it was now undeniably open. Not fully, just enough to reveal the menacing edge of the black void beneath. Something had unlatched it, or, more terrifyingly, something had emerged from within. I finally roused my uncle. He offered no verbal response when I pointed towards the barn. He simply walked to the closet and retrieved a powerful flashlight and an old, formidable hunting knife. "Stay here," he instructed quietly. I, however, followed him anyway, maintaining a few steps behind, my heart pounding relentlessly in my throat. As we approached the barn, I once again noticed the air. It was even colder still. My uncle stepped inside first, directing the beam of his flashlight directly at the now open cellar entrance. It revealed only stairs, narrow, visibly worn, and leading straight into an abyss of blackness. There was no sound emanating from below, but that particular absence of sound made the situation even more terrifying. He walked directly to the cellar opening, then paused. It was securely locked, he murmured, speaking more to himself than to me. It hasn't been opened in countless years. I cautiously inquired what was concealed down there. He hesitated noticeably. Just something my father left behind. Something we were explicitly supposed to forget. I remained positioned by the barn door while he descended halfway down the steps. The light beam flickered erratically for a moment, then steadied itself. I couldn't discern much, just the broad expanse of his shoulders from behind. Then he abruptly stopped, turned slightly towards me, and stated, "You need to depart right now." I did not argue. I sprinted back to the house, securely locked the door, and anxiously waited. Minutes elapsed, perhaps even more. Then the barn door slammed shut with such immense force that it caused the window glass in the house to vibrate. My uncle never re-entered the house that night. In the morning, I discovered him asleep on the porch, the hunting knife resting securely in his lap. We did not discuss the events. He left the barn untouched. The door remained steadfastly shut. A new padlock appeared the following day. It was notably bigger, and affixed much tighter than the previous one. I inquired of him once more what was sequestered down there. He simply replied, "Whatever it is, it listens. That is sufficient." I departed a few days later. My uncle waved goodbye from the porch, but he never offered a smile. Every now and then, I still find my thoughts drifting to that oppressive cellar, to how it felt as though it were patiently waiting. Not for us specifically, but simply for someone with enough ill-fated curiosity to open the forbidden thing. The most disturbing aspect of all is that I never heard anything discernible down there. No voice, no footsteps, no scream, just an absolute, profound silence. And somehow, that very silence felt infinitely worse than any sound could have been.